We go now to Paris, France, for a special interview with French President Emmanuel Macron. Mr. President, welcome to Face the Nation.
Welcome. Happy to see you, and welcome in Paris.
How and when will you lift the COVID restrictions? Will vaccinated Americans be able to visit France this summer?
I hope so, and I do think so. Look, we are catching up, and definitely we are vaccinating more and more people. We vaccinated more than 12 million people. We have mid-May the objective of 20 million, 30 million mid-June, and at the end of the summer, all the adults will be offered a vaccine, which means that we are progressing, and we will progressively lift the restrictions after the beginning of May, which means that we will organize indeed summertime with our professionals in France for French, European citizens, but as well for American citizens. So we are working hard to propose a very concrete solution, especially for your citizens who are vaccinated, so with a special pass, I would say.
Have you worked that out with the White House?
Yes, we started to discuss that. Now our ministers in charge are finalizing the technical discussions. In terms of method, in fact, we are building a European certificate to facilitate the travels after these restrictions between the different European countries with testing and vaccination. And the idea indeed is altogether to offer that to the American citizen when they decided to vaccinate, or with a PCR test being negative. So the idea is indeed to always control the virus, to maximize the vaccination, and to progressively lift the restrictions and have the best possible summer with the opportunity for your citizen to come in our country, because this is something we are very proud in.
Your government said it will still administer about 200,000 doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, even though exports are currently halted from the U.S. Do you think it was a mistake for the U.S. to halt those exports?
Look, I think all of us did learn from the very beginning of this crisis. I think the US made a tremendous job in terms of innovation and acceleration just to get these new vaccines, the mRNA type of vaccine, and to produce very rapidly. Now, as I told you, we are catching up, and definitely we decided to be much more open. But now, for me, we have to look at the future. Where are we all together? The United States and Europe. We have to accelerate vaccination. We want to lift the maximum possible measures and to control the pandemic. And we want to cooperate. Because when you look today at the figures and the realities, you are producing a lot of vaccines. But to produce these vaccines, you do need the European for some ingredients and so on. And in Europe, we are buying more and more vaccines, but we are producing more and more vaccines. And this year we will have 2.5 billion doses in 2021, but we will produce more and more doses. And we will be in a situation to be number one in terms of production and to be partner with the US. So I think for me now, the question is how we can team up for the coming months and years, because definitely we will need vaccines for the end of 2021, but probably we will need boosters and additional vaccines in order to deal with the variants. And we have to team up together to help the rest of the world to be vaccinated. So for me now, everything is about acceleration, more production in Europe and in the US, and partnership for our people, but as well as the rest of the world.
But Mr. President, the European Union has been slow, as you know. That has hurt your country in rolling out these vaccines. Given that you need vaccines right now, are you going to buy Russia's Sputnik vaccine to make up for the shortfall?
Look, I think now, thanks to the acceleration of the deliveries, especially we had additional doses coming from Pfizer for the second quarter. And because of the fact that we accelerated production in Europe, we are definitely catching up, and we will be in a situation to meet our targets with what we have now. There a few member states decided to have discussion with Sputnik, but we have a very few simple principles. First, if there is no recognition of a vaccine by our European sanitary authorities, there is no way to use this vaccine on our soil. And at this stage, the Russian vaccine is not recognized by our authorities. We have discussion, but it will take weeks, not to say months. Second, for me, it makes sense first to produce vaccines based on our research and being invented and produced with our industrials. So I will prioritize European vaccination and vaccination with our partners. So I don't think that the Russian vaccine today is a solution to an acceleration, because it will take time to have the authorization of the European agency, and it will take time to produce on our continent such a vaccine. And I think it's much more efficient to accelerate production of Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Valneva, Sanofi, which is arriving in a few months, and some others, and CureVac. So I think we have to focus on these first types of vaccine.
When will you give away that 5% of vaccine doses that you say rich countries like yours should give to poorer countries?
Look, 1 year ago we started to have such an initiative called ACT-A, which is an initiative endorsed by the G20 for full solidarity vis-à-vis the poor countries. For very simple reasons, for moral and ethical reasons, but as well for pragmatic reasons. Because all the poor countries are hurt, as we are, by the pandemic. But their economy is sometimes destroyed or very traumatized by the consequences of the pandemic. And because if we don't vaccinate in these countries, there is no way to get rid of the virus. Because if we leave these countries being contaminated by COVID-19 in South and Latin America, in Africa, you will have more and more people being contaminated. You will have new variants, and they will come back in our countries. So I think this is not efficient just to be focused on a rich country. So 1 year ago, we launched this initiative. This is to help them to vaccinate, and this is to help them basically as well to precisely improve their health system, because this is as important as vaccination, diagnostics, and treatments. We started to do so. Now we have to accelerate. And this is where I do believe your country has a huge role, because you can provide financing, and I want to thank the US for the $4 billion committed to COVAX, which is the vehicle to provide vaccines, but as well for the doses we will send all together. And I think between now and June, we have to send a maximum doses of vaccine, which is a tiny part of what we get for us, to vaccinate the workers of the healthcare system in Africa. It's very limited, but these guys are working hard to preserve the health system, and this is something we can do. And same in Latin America. After summer, we will accelerate these deliveries, we will accelerate this solidarity. And on top of that, what we have to provide is financing as well for these economies. But it is essential, and I think this is another way where the partnership between the US and Europe is absolutely critical, and this is how we can provide such a powerful project for the rest of the world.
I want to ask you about climate. President Biden brought the U.S. back into that Paris Climate Change Accord 3 months ago, but hardly any of the countries that signed it, including yours, have actually met their targets. And now President Biden is going to ask for further cuts to emissions. What makes you think it'll be achievable this time?
Yes, I think because now it's time to deliver, it's time to rush, and President Biden is 100% right to do so. First of all, I want to say that during the 4 president years, your citizens, your entrepreneurs, your investors, some of your states, were very committed to the Paris Agreement and this trend, and did reduce their emission. But I think the decision taken by your president in January this year was super important. Welcome back. I was extremely happy. because now the US and the federal government decided to join again and to commit. Second, as Europeans, we increased our targets for 2030 and 2050 a few months ago, because indeed, we were lagging behind in comparison with our targets. And now we have to accelerate because we are living the first consequences of basically climate disorders. And I think it's not something we are doing just for the future generation, which is extremely important. But this is now. This is even more urgent than 5 years ago. So your president is right to increase
But don't you need China and India to make those commitments?
Yes, you're right. We need two things. We need to accelerate innovation and ability to deliver. And I'm a strong believer in some tough decision to stop coal plants, to stop all the CO2 emission to produce our energy. This is why I do believe on nuclear and renewables and to accelerate in this strategy. We have now to modernize our way to produce in terms of mobility, I mean our cars, our houses and so on. We have to reduce the CO2 emission. So this is an agenda of innovation thanks to green technologies. This is an agenda of investment. This is exactly what we did with the European package and recovery plan and the French recovery plan and what now your federal government is doing. So first, if we want to reach this target, we have to accelerate innovation and investment and to bring everybody in this project. On top of that, you're right. We need India and China to be with us. India is very committed. And they are an emerging countries. This is a huge democracy with a lot of inequalities to deal with. But they launched with us the solar initiative 3 years ago now. They are improving their system and they committed to reduce especially HFC emissions. They are super polluters and even worse than CO2. China remained in Paris Agreement. They increased their targets, but they are still for carbon neutrality in 2060 and a peak in 2030. This morning with Chancellor Merkel, we had a discussion with President Xi. And I think we felt the commitments of President Xi on climate to work with the US and with Europe. First, to accelerate his target of 2030 to have the peak emission, and in some cities and some regions to do better and faster. Second, he announced this morning his decision to join what we call the Kigali Amendment, which means to reduce the HFC emissions for his countries, which is
don't these things ultimately put a burden, though,
to fight against this effect?
Don't leaders like yourself need to just speak plainly to the public and say, look, this needs to happen. It may cost you your job. It may mean prices go up, but this is a price that all of you have to pay in order to meet these targets.
Look, I think obviously we will have to change a lot of things in our economy. And I think what we have to do is an agenda of investment and innovation, but indeed we have to increase the price of carbon and we have to help this transition to happen for our entrepreneurs and our households. If you go to the White House or the Élysée Palace to say, now guys, you will have to adapt yourself, you will pay a much higher price and so on, I can tell you, you will increase social inequalities. I did such a mistake, I have to say, and I can tell you in 2018, because we underestimate the impact on middle classes. So you have to accompany people. And this agenda is a green and social agenda, is a green and investment agenda. And we have to accept for a few years to invest public money in these transitions, to help innovation and diffusion of this innovation. You have to accept to change business models and behavior of investors to finance green investments and to penalize those who don't make this move. And you have to accept to accompany your households to make these investments and make it feasible for them. This is something totally new. This is a revolution. But this revolution, if you want it to happen, we have to help middle classes and poor people to make this change with us. This is a comprehensive and inclusive agenda. I'm sure about that now. And I can tell you with a lot of humility, I'm even more sure because I made mistakes myself.
Mr. President, there are roughly 31,000 Russian troops amassed on the border of Ukraine right now. What will France do if Vladimir Putin invades?
I think the situation is unacceptable. And Chancellor Merkel and myself spoke with President Putin a few days ago. I received a few hours ago President Zelensky, President of Ukraine, and we had a discussion as well with Chancellor Merkel. And we sent a very clear message, totally in line with the one delivered by President Biden. Russia has to de-escalate. This is clear. The situation today and the level of tension at the border is absolutely counterproductive and unacceptable. And we are fully committed in what we call the Normandy format, Russia, Ukraine, Germany and France, to deliver, following the Minsk agreement, i.e. we want now a political process to deal with some Ukrainian regions and to pacify
But Vladimir Putin has blown that off
for Ukraine and Ukrainian people.
And sanctions have not stopped him. Those diplomatic efforts have not stopped him. You yourself have referenced NATO as being brain dead. What is actually going to stop Vladimir Putin from invading?
Look, I think what happened a few years ago when Ukraine was invaded, it's not the failure of diplomacy. It's the failure of our collective credibility vis-à-vis Russia. And I think when we put red lines, we have to make them respected by our people and the others. And I think we have to be clear and tough. And I think what happened first in Syria provided the feeling to President Putin that now it was a Pandora box. And he provoked and basically invaded Ukraine. Right after that, we launched precisely the Minsk process, which was the beginning of a diplomatic agenda. And I cannot tell that this is a failure of diplomacy. It was a failure of a naive approach vis-à-vis Russia. I'm definitely in favor of discussion with Russia, with an open, quiet and respectful discussion with Russia. But I think that when we put red lines, we have to be sure to be credible and to make these red lines respected by the others, and to be clear when Russia doesn't respect it, or Russia or its partner. This is what happened in Syria in 2018, and together with the US and UK, we intervened in an operation precisely after the use of chemical weapons. Now in Ukraine, if we want to be efficient, we have to accelerate the diplomatic agenda, and US, Europe, all of us have to be very clear vis-à-vis Russia. We will never accept a new military operation on the Ukrainian soil, and we have to build the way to be credible vis-à-vis.
Do you think that what President Biden did with sanctions will make any difference to Vladimir Putin this time? Will it stop him?
I think we need an approach, to be clear, based on two pillars. One, dialogue, and I fully share as well the willingness of your president to dialogue, and I'm sure that President Putin can be ready to reopen dialogue. But if we want a better system in terms of arms control, if we want to stabilize a lot of existing crises in the world today, we need an open and frank dialogue with Russia. On the other side,
will you sanction
we have
Russia
to be
if he
clear
invades?
when we are not aligned. And I think after an unacceptable behavior, indeed we have to sanction. This is what we did after Ukraine, or after a series of crises which happened. And I think we have to define clear red lines with Russia. This is the only way to be credible. I think that sanctions are not sufficient in themselves, but sanctions are part of the package. I do prefer constructive dialogue, but to have a constructive and efficient dialogue, you need credibility.
Mr. President, race is a very heated topic in this country right now, and I want to ask you about something you recently said. France is a former colonial power, but you said, in comparison of our two countries, I'm sure of one thing: we are not the United States of America. We have a preference for equality that is not found in the US. Our values are not quite the same. We have an attachment to social democracy, to more equality. What do you mean by that?
I think the United States and Europe are facing common challenges. A rise of inequalities and hatred speeches and so on, and tensions in our societies. And race arrives, I would say, on top of that, because we didn't fix this issue. And this is an existing question in our society. In your society, you had segregation, and you managed to precisely react and reorganize your society in the 60s with positive and affirmative action and new clear policies in order to deal with this phenomenon. Our history is very different because we were colonial states, and we are at the same time, we're still countries of immigration with a lot of people coming from former colonies and from, for instance, African continent. And we have definitely this question of race, which is at the very core of our society and creating a lot of tensions when people basically are victims of discrimination, and when people are pushing racist speech, racism or unacceptable speeches. My conviction is that we have to address this issue by first, transparency and fair assessment. This is why I launched new platforms to fight against discrimination, racism, and so on. Second, a quiet and open dialogue to understand how it happened. And in a certain way, to deconstruct our own history, but without any confusion. Our histories are very different. The way we behaved in the past, the way we built our own trauma are very different, even if we have common phenomena. So I think we need basically to go to the very root of this phenomenon, but we need to launch new, concrete, and determined policies to get rid of racism in our societies. This is critical. But third, we have to rebuild the unity on our societies. And one of the big risks today is to be inefficient in dealing with discrimination and to, in a certain way, to push to the fragmentation in our societies by, I would say, encouraging a sort of construction where a nation would be the addition of different races or addition of different minorities. I don't think so. I think a nation is based on unity with differences, is based on unity of projects, and we should never accept the fragmentation of this project through all these differences and specificities. So what we need in a certain way, on both sides of the Atlantic, is a policy of recognition, building our unity by being more efficient against inequalities, against discrimination, and working for unity and recognizing all the differences. This is a huge challenge, but this is one of the critical challenges of our generation.
Lastly, sir, you said after the storming of the U.S. Capitol in January that it was a sign of the West's failure to rein in social media companies. You've been talking about taking on big tech. What kind of censorship or regulation are you calling for?
I think, once again, this is, for me, one of the most important agenda we have together with the United States. We have this agenda on health, with COVID-19, on climate, on inequalities, and on fighting for democracy by regulating these big companies of precise social networks. Why? Because today our children, our people, are extremely influenced by these social networks and what's happening on these platforms. And we have to to better regulate the content, respecting free speech, obviously, but by stopping being naive in a certain way. We started to do so to fight against terrorism with the Christchurch call. And I do hope your country will join the platform we built with Prime Minister of New Zealand and a few other leaders, and with some of these entrepreneurs to get rid of any terrorist content in 1 hour. We did it in Europe. But now we have to fight against anti-Semitism, racism, hatred speeches on social networks. This is by precisely engaging these platforms, but this is by regulating them. So I think
who would regulate
for the
them?
coming months and years, the US-European agenda, this is a common agenda. You have to regulate them in saying, when you are in the streets, it's forbidden
Isn't
to
that
be
censorship?
racist, to be anti-Semitic. No, I would not say this is censorship, because if you are in the street with me, you cannot insult somebody like that. Your law, my law, do penalize such behavior. You cannot hide your face and suddenly hurt somebody. You cannot push people to go to kill other people. This is forbidden when you go in the streets, in public space. But today, concretely, it's not forbidden on social media. So what we have to do is to create a new public order on social media, because this is public space, because this is the place where our children, our young people, our people spend hours a day. So we need the same rule, because without public order on this space, there is no more freedom. So yes, you need regulation, but common regulation in US and Europe. And when I say you have to regulate them, you have to regulate unacceptable content, you have to regulate them and to give responsibility principle for the editors of this guy in this part. And you have to tax them, because a lot of these players are not fairly taxed and are competitors with the rest of the economy and real economy. This is why I do believe in a common agenda in OECD for a common taxation of internet and social media companies. This is absolutely critical.
Mr. President, I'm being told that we are running out of time, but I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. No, I was happy to have the opportunity to answer your questions, and I would just want to pass a very clear and simple message. I think we are, all of us, in the middle of a terrible crisis and a lot of fears. COVID-19, climate change, and so on, and security, and inequalities, and so on. I do believe that our common values, I do believe that our strong faith in open and liberal democracies is the best way to address these challenges. We will have to invent a new model. We will have to regulate this capitalism. We will have to deal with inequalities. We will have to reinvent a new narrative and new actions, new investment on green technologies, new cooperation for vaccination. I think we have the opportunity to do it together and to build and invent our future. I'm a strong believer in this positive and ambitious agenda together, and I hope we will deliver hand in hand together.
We will watch for
Thank
that,
you.
Mr. President. Thank you.